if a person was unvirtuous and then starts to become virtuous, why would Aristotle call that person's life unhappy? To answer this question, we have to think about the relationship between virtue and happiness in Aristotle's ethical theory. Happiness, in his view, is the highest good. It's the long-term project of a human life. Happiness is not exactly the same thing as pleasure. Happiness can involve pleasure, but happiness isn't reducible to pleasure. Now, how does one become happy, according to Aristotle? How does one achieve eudaimonia? One achieves eudaimonia by developing virtues. This is what Aristotle means when he speaks of the fulfillment of one's potential. The development of virtues is a sustained process of living according to the doctrine of the mean. And it comes in, one might say, stages. It comes a little bit at a time. A virtue is a disposition to choose the mean with regard to some area of importance in human life. So, for example, with regard to pleasure, the mean is temperance. That is, the virtue of handling pleasure excellently is temperance. The person who's excessive is self-indulgent. The person who's deficient, Aristotle refers to as insensible. To become temperate requires a great deal of experience. Ideally, it requires a good upbringing, an upbringing that habituates one to neither be excessive nor deficient with regard to pleasures. And it requires constant practice. That is, even after the habit is developed, it requires constant maintenance, upkeep. It requires always living according to the doctrine of the mean with regard to pleasures. Now, if a person lacks the virtue of temperance and then begins to become temperate, that is, if someone, let's say, is self-indulgent and tends to go overboard with pleasures, and then begins to apply the doctrine of the mean to the areas in one's life that concern pleasures, then that person is becoming virtuous, becoming temperate. And there's some intermediate stages between adopting the doctrine of the mean with regard to pleasures and actually possessing the virtue. So Aristotle would say it's not right to call someone who is in the process of developing temperance a temperate person. They haven't established the enduring state of character that is the virtue of temperance, at least not yet. Hopefully they will. But I've just used one example here. In Book 2, Chapter 7, Aristotle gives the examples of many different virtues with their excesses and deficiencies. No one of these virtues equals happiness. What happiness is, what eudaimonia is a life in constant development of as many virtues as possible. So his standard for happiness is actually quite high. It's not just acting virtuously once. It's not even possessing one virtue. Happiness, that is eudaimonia, is a life filled with developed virtues. Now, is the person who is developing a virtue better? That is more excellent, more virtuous? Once the process of developing the virtue is underway than that person was when they were not in the process of developing the virtue? For sure. For sure, it is always better to be in the process of developing virtues than not having a clue. Of course, it's much better yet to have developed virtues than to be in the process of development. But wait, I thought you said the process of developing virtues is ongoing. And yes, it is. So even once one has developed virtues, one still needs to keep them up. Think about habits. Think about any habit. What's easier, to develop a good habit or to break a good habit? Unfortunately, most people would say to break a good habit is way easier to develop a good habit. So even once one has developed one or more virtues, one needs to be in the constant process of upkeep. But if one has developed good habits, it is much easier to keep up those good habits than to start good habits from scratch. So the virtuous person will have an easier time continuing to be virtuous. They've been doing it for a while. It's become a habit. And thus they know the benefits of it. They know the good it brings in a person's life. The well-tempered person, for example, knows the good it brings in his or her own life to be well-tempered. That is, to not be flying off the handle, going crazy with anger at the least provocation. And on the deficient side, to not be constantly having people walk all over you because you refuse to stand up for yourself. So good habits, virtues, have immediate real-world benefits, according to Aristotle. He still doesn't think of that as exactly the same thing as being happy. It's certainly not the same thing as eudaimonia, a life fully well lived. But yeah, it's much better than not having a virtue. Could the development of virtues bring pleasure? Aristotle would argue that yes, it can, and that this is a distinctively human type of pleasure, the pleasure that we find specifically in living according to the doctrine of the mean and developing habits that are guided by the doctrine of the mean. So if Aristotle wouldn't quite say that a person who is in the process of developing a virtue is a happy person in the sense of eudaimonia, he would say that there is a reward, there is a pleasure in, number one, the development of a virtue and the possession of a virtue once it is developed. In fact, the experience of feeling pleasure at hitting the mean, Aristotle says at one point, is a sign that the virtue is developed. One isn't just forcing oneself to hit the mean and going, oh no, it's so terrible that I have to control myself and live according to the doctrine of the mean. When one takes pleasure in hitting the mean, Aristotle says at one point, that's a sign that the virtuous state of character is getting pretty solid. So even if Aristotle wouldn't call a person who's in the process of developing a virtue happy, there is still a real-time reward in the process. It's not quite the fulfillment of the human function in its fullest sense, but every bit along the way is to be valued, is to be viewed as positive. So perhaps one thing that we need to keep in mind here is that when Aristotle speaks of happiness in the sense of eudaimonia, he is not just speaking of a short-term happiness. He is speaking of a long-term way of viewing a human life in its fullness, not just the short-term experience of doing well, which is valuable, but is not the whole story.